Hi, my name is Sarah Drasner, and I am here to talk to you about SVG, innovative SVG animations today. And I'm really excited to be here because I really enjoy talking about SVG animations. They're my favorite thing in the world, and so it's really great to be able to share it with other people as well. So yeah, I am a web consultant, and I take that very seriously. This is also my relationship with authority and me and my mom. I used to be a manager of UX design and engineering, and now I work as a consultant on a bunch of different projects for large groups of people, from clients large to small. And what's really nice about coming here and talking about SVG animations and animations in general is that it's just such a party. So you can make a party with SVG animation, or you can, have the JavaScript be the event coordinator for you. Get it, event. It's a really bad dad joke, but I'm going to have a few more of those over the course of this talk. Why are we even going to talk about SVG at all? What is interesting about SVG? Some of you are designers and some of you are developers, but everyone here should probably be aware of SVG because it's super powerful. It's crisp on any display, which as designers you're really going to like, because sometimes things get mushy and you build out these beautiful mock-ups that took you forever, and then you look at it on the web and you're like, what happened? It's crisp on any display, even for retina screens. If you're a developer, that means you don't have to replace images like over and over again, do those picture elements with like tons of different image requests. That's kind of a pain. So there's less HTTP requests to handle because you're not going back and forth. And also you can do inline SVG, which means that you can have images directly in your HTML and remove the need for HTTP requests at all. It's really easily scalable for responsive, which is really nice. And I'll go into some details for some of the really cool things we can do with that in a minute. And it's a super small file size if we design for performance. This is important for both designers and developers. If you design for performance is a really important part of this, and we'll go over what makes it super flexible and great, and how you can do it well and badly. It's also really easy to animate. It has a navigable DOM, which means that you can reach inside of it and change it and manipulate it, and it's built with math. So if you learn what all of those principles are behind it, you can manipulate it on the fly, which I'll show you as well. It's really easy to make accessible. This is something, again, that designers and developers should be caring about. You can have the screen reader go over the whole thing and just understand that its role is presentation, or you can actually have them go into bits of it that are informative and have them pick up and read parts of the SVG. This is a really great thing for us working with stuff that the blind and people who are poor-sighted, we're all going to be old someday, so caring about those things for the future is good, yeah. Because if we're not doing things like this, because if we're not animating, if we're not, pushing the boundaries of what's possible, we're not using the web to its full potential. The web is more than just a static, bright box. There's so much we can do, and there's so many engaging user experiences that we can have for people that we're not totally taking advantage of yet. So whether you're a designer or a developer, thinking about ways that you can manipulate things to actually help your users is a big thing here. And it's fun. You guys remember fun? That was fun. A lot of times when I talk to developers, people don't think that SVG is well supported. I think it got a bad reputation for not being well supported, but look at all that green. It's already very well supported. The only thing you'll probably have trouble with is IE8, and maybe you don't need to care about IE8. Look at your web analytics. So it's really, really good for narrative. So Sarah Sweden showed this. This is my animation. She showed it at a conference that she was giving, and she asked everybody in the audience who in the audience was an introvert, and no one raised their hands. Yeah, Flash is dead. I know that that was like really hard for people because everybody got used to this format, and then people still kind of think like, oh, there's all this stuff that we can't do anymore because we don't have Flash. There's tons of stuff that we can do now that people aren't even used to. So what is SVG animation good for? It's good for interactive and immersive animations. It's good for narrative animations like the one you just saw. It's really good for UI and UX animations. We're going to talk about that just a little bit today. It's awesome for prototyping because you can throw it together really quickly and show clients work that's really, really fast, and you're able to like manipulate it on the fly and write in your browser, which makes it really easy. You don't have to go back to a graphics editor necessarily. And it's super awesome for data visualizations because you can manipulate it on the fly. Accessibility is a big thing here. I talked about that in just a second ago, but here's an example of some of these things. And actually, I'm not the world's biggest expert on accessible SVGs. I can do them, but this article by Heather on the bottom here is a really, really great article. It's on CSS-Tricks. It's called Accessible SVGs. We have good SEO, so if you want to type that into the browser, you'll probably find it. It has tons and tons of resources. So before we get started, we've got to optimize. SVG OMG is really great. It's a web-based browser by Jake Archibald where you can just put your SVG in and it'll figure out your SVG and pull things out and reduce the file size and make it super small. That's based off of SVGO, which is a terminal-based editor. If you use that, you should pair it with SVGO GUI because the way that you optimize can actually change the way that an SVG looks. There's also Peter Collinridge's editor. It's like an old Rails app, so if you're old school, it's kind of fun. Not all ways to move SVGs are created equal. I know we're going through some of the theory stuff and then we'll do some crazy things in a minute. Not all are created equal. Opacity and transforms cause less repaints in your browser than any other way of moving an SVG. And you might be kind of bummed out by that. That's just 2 properties. But all of the animations that you're going to see today that I'm going to show you are done with just those 2 properties. So it actually is pretty performant and there's a lot of stuff you can do. I have more information on both of these things. Debugging keyframe animations is for people who like CSS, and high performance animation is for designers to learn how to design properly with animations and keep those path sizes small. So it's really good for narrative, as I mentioned before, and it's great if you want to pair it with sound and text. Cool. So another thing that's really good, I'm not just going to show you these crazy things that you might not be able to put on a website. Some of the real beauty of SVG is the way that it can morph and change. So this is an example for UI and UX animations with SVG. So if you're working with a contact form on your website, the user has to sometimes go through many modals and forms, and that experience can feel really, really kind of rigid. So in this example, we've got this that morphs into the actual contact form. The contact title goes into the spot, and then the email moves over, and then the submit and email turn into the loaders, which then give you a success. And the success animation was probably the most bright animation you had. It's a bounce animation, so it really captures your attention. The thing about a website is your users are constantly scanning their surroundings. They're using an event called saccade to create a spatial map of what's around them. When you're looking straight at a picture, you're never looking straight at it. You're kind of making a mental model of what you're seeing. So if you're continually shoving new modals in people's faces and stuff, you're breaking their spatial awareness constantly, and that causes cognitive leaks for your users. So if you can make that animation and that experience more fluid and more intuitive, then it feels like less time. It feels like less steps. And SVG is really good for that, because then when I collapse it down, if I say to you, hey, where's that contact form? You'd say, it's in there. But there's no in there. It's all divs, it's all just like moving things with positioning and things like that. That's just, sleight of hands and tricks with your eye. So stuff like this can be really, really informative for your users. So if we're going to talk about morphing and do something a little bit fun with it, I work for CSS-Tricks. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been on that site. I used it a lot before I worked there. So Chris asked me to do a kind of like Easter egg for the site, which is this like logo morph. So if I click on this, then different things kind of appear. They're all kind of tech related. So the S turns into a link, and this is a fork. And our logo is actually this query selector all-star. So I played off of that and made a Saturn, and you get it. So if you're designing for animation, I'm the designer and the dev for this, but what I find really helpful, like if I have to think about myself in two brains, is that I design everything first, and then I slowly unveil it. So if I was going to hand this file to an animator to do it for me, I would have put everything on the page at once, and then shown with groups what I'm moving and what I'm displaying and what I'm not. So like hiding things initially and then having them morph into each other is one quick way to like understand a concept or plan it all out. So one of the main principles, if you're going to take something away, is design everything first and then slowly unveil things. I think it's really great to work with storyboards. Like I make the ugliest storyboards in the world. When people talk about storyboards and they show these like beautiful comics, that's really intimidating. And who wants to make a comic before they start working on an animation? I just kind of doodle these things. It's not about the bee. Don't make it about the bee. And these kind of like quick little jots help me understand what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the time. I now know that like 10-second scribble that I was never supposed to show anyone and am now showing you today is going to show me how I'm going to be working with these materials. These ugly storyboards save me a lot of time. I don't even remember what that was for. So just remember that like you just need to get the point across to yourself so that you can start working. So we're going to talk about tools for just a second, and then we'll do a deep dive into one of them. I work with animation constantly, and I'm just kind of a naturally curious person, so I like working with a lot of different tools, and I try them all out. So these are my recommendations for what you should be working with. You don't have to listen to me or anything, but if you're confused about where to get started, these are the things that I would kind of say. CSS and SCSS, SAS, is all really awesome, and it's really great for small sequences and simple interactions. But once you start delaying and getting into more than 3, you should really consider switching to something like GreenSock. GreenSock is really great for complex movement. It is particularly good for cross-browser inconsistencies. So like something that you might come across with CSS and SVG animations is there's sometimes weird bugs like Safari, and in order to kind of solve a lot of those issues, GreenSock does a lot of stuff under the hood for you so that you don't have to worry about that. That's really good for a production site. React motion is super awesome and really beautiful, but it's similar to game-based animation. So GreenSock is more like sequential. You're like, you do this, and then you go there, and then you want to do this, and then you want to go there. React motion gives things mass and weight and physics and sends it on its way. So if you're trying to look for like controlling this specific amount of time, that's not what it's good for. What it is good for is interruptible animations. Like say you want to make a chat head go over here with your finger and then here. It's really, really beautiful for that. Snap SVG, people think is an animation engine. It's not. It's actually more like jQuery for SVG. Even if you ask Dimitri, the guy who wrote it, I'm not putting words in his mouth, he says it was never meant to be an animation API. Even the demos that he shows on the site a lot of times are written in CSS animations. So you can use it. It's not really meant for that. Web Animation API looks really great, and I'm very excited for it. But we're still waiting on support. You have to use a polyfill in order to use it, and the polyfill changes because the spec changes, and that's not good for production sites, unless you're the kind of developer who really likes to work on the weekends. So I would wait on support for that for just a minute before using it. Velocity.js is similar to GreenSock or GSAP, but it has a lot less bells and whistles. And I ran some benchmarks to find out what was more performant, and Velocity failed a lot of those tests. So I found that GreenSock was more performant than Velocity. If you read otherwise, it's probably a marketing blog. But you should test these things for yourself, because that post was written a long time ago. And browsers, even the way that browsers report these things change, and specs change, and APIs change. So definitely test things for yourself. Mo.js is written by a guy named Lego Mushroom, and he writes the most beautiful demos, and it looks really, really great, and it's still in beta. So this is one, again, that you should play around with, and it might be like a future of web animating, but it's still moving around some and not quite stable yet. D3 was built for data visualizations, but you can do a ton more with it, and it's really, really great for animations and transitions. So I mentioned the interruptible animation. So this is React Motion. What's nice about the staggers here is that one property is getting updated from the last property. So what's happening is it's, in essence, getting it for free, and it's getting updated as I move it. So you can get these really complex and beautiful animations as I'm moving things around. That's really nice for these simple one motion interactions. For things like, chaining interactions, we just got on end in React Motion, but there's no loops without writing infinite loops. I would also say that it's a little bit more verbose than GreenSock, so use the right tools for the job. And if we're going to look at this, actually under the hood, if you're like, oh, CSS animations suck, it's actually CSS animations when you're working with it. That's what is under the hood for React Motion. So you're actually using WebKit transform, animate 3D. So that's really, really interesting and awesome. So let's make some cool stuff. We're going to focus on GreenSock for the rest of this day and in these demos. So there's a lot of stuff that we can use already in the browser that's really awesome. So this pen, for instance, so I made this game. It's about a hipster elephant that wants to get tacos, but his friends keep texting him to change plans, and it's based on real life events. So it's a really simple 2D side scroller. Oh wait, I wanted to get the margarita because the margarita special gives me more points. But come on, margarita. Okay, it's randomized, so I can't plan when I'm gonna go get the margarita. But you can play it on CodePen anytime that you want. Oh, there we go. There's the margarita. Okay, so here's a heart meter up here. So I'm gonna kind of go into what went into making this game. So how do we use SVG here? 3 ways. We had it directly inline in the HTML for things that we were going to loop, so we just put it in our HTML, and then we grabbed it with GreenSock, and we moved it back and forth and stuff. That's super easy. We're using React to create this game, so we also have background images for things like the taco. We have it inline in React, and I'll show you one version of what that is. So here's just our super simple component, and this is our heart meter. We have all the state controlling the logic of where our points live and stuff, and I'm not going to go into that so that the designers in the audience don't fall asleep. But here we've got this width that's this.props.score that I'm handing down, and what's really awesome about SVG is it's made with math. So what's cool about it is you can do things like add 250, and the SVG will just update the width. What we have here is a rect that has a width, a height, and an x coordinate. That's 20, and that moves over, and a y coordinate. That's pretty easy to understand and pretty easy to work with, especially if you're just like making something get longer or bigger, and that's why it's so good for data visualizations. So how did we animate this? There are 4 ways. We have GreenSock doing the loops in functions outside React, which we mentioned before. We have request animation frame, which we're not going to talk too much about today, to detect the collisions, because it's running constantly. It's going to check if things intersect. We have GreenSock for the key press events, so like anytime I'm moving my keys back and forth to make the elephant go up and down. And repeating callbacks for the tacos and margaritas that are going across the screen. So if I'm going to just look at one of these functions, there's a lot going on here. We're just going to look at one small part of it. We have this flyby function that I'm calling, right? And then we have, if the game is over, then return, because we don't want things going across the screen if the game is over. And then really at the end of this, I say a bunch of like from to, I'm going from y, from a random position to y to another random position, and then on complete, I pass these same parameters and call it again. So it's similar to recursion, not exactly recursion here. GreenSock is really, really quite nice and easy to work with. This is some of the syntax. I'm really bad at live coding, so I had this monster code things for you. He's going to just show you some stuff. So this is like tween max to I, and then this is going to be 2 tween, so I'm doing tween max to I and antenna. See how simple that was? So now I'm going to add a timeline instead of tween max, and then they're going to follow each other in time. And then I'm going to kind of like wrap that to make it like a little bit more organized and make a master timeline. And I have it wrapped in that function. And then I can add another function that has another timeline and add them both to the master. So it's going to blink and do that, and then flap. And then he's going to say bye. Bye. Okay. So one of the big reasons I use GreenSock, and I actually like strayed from them recently and had to go back to them because they actually solve so many of these weird bugs. I think this one it was supposed to be fixed in Firefox, but I saw something weird the other day. Anyway, so Firefox and Safari sometimes don't work appropriately. IE, come on IE. If you want to vote on support for transforms on SVG and Edge, they have like I should have put a link here. You can go vote on it. It's really important. So that's really, really awesome. The other interesting and awesome thing about GreenSock is its timeline. So we can stack tweens, we can set them before and after one another, change their placement in time, group them into scenes, add relative labels, animate the scenes. You can animate your animations. What? And then you can make the whole thing faster and move the placement. But we're animating, right? So like, why don't I just animate for you how that works? All of this can be done without recalculation. So if we're talking about CSS animations, we have to do these keyframes at percentages, right? And then let's say you're like done with this animation and it's like nested 3 deep, and one person on your team wants this one animation to be at the beginning to be a little bit shorter, which happens all the time. And so then you have to adjust it. You have to adjust all of the percentages and times for anything that follows. And that could be kind of a bummer. If you're working with JavaScript, you don't have to. It just follows. So I made this pen. It has this like animation that I'm going to show you. So there's like a repeated section that fires a few times that middle part. And they're all wrapped in these functions. So each function is plotted on this like invisible. I'm just showing you a visualization of what that would look like. It fires 4 times on that timeline. And then this function fires here. And I coded it so that I didn't have to narrate it, so maybe you should just watch. Cool, so that was really nice. But I can also just like swap 2 of the functions in the timeline, and with 1 line of code, make it all go in another direction. And let's say it's just like, oh, I just want it to be like a little bit faster. So that's pretty cool. There's a ton of other things for complex animation that we'll go through. Motion along a path, it has the widest support for motion along a path right now. Smile used to be really good at this, but right now it's getting deprecated, it's not getting deprecated, people don't know. And it is actually moving into CSS as a property, which will be awesome, but the support isn't very good yet. So right now, this has the longest tail of support for motion along a path. It's really, really good for draggable. Draggable is one of those things that you think of as probably easy, and then you try to implement it without a library, and you're like, this is actually complicated. So the way that you can work with draggable is really, really great for this too. There's CSS properties, so you can make things go forward and backwards in space. Draw SVG, so you can make a thing look like it's drawing itself, like we just did with that line. Morph SVG, which we covered with the CSS-Tricks animation. Relative color tweening, which is super awesome, especially if you're a designer. You don't have to rethink of all of those colors every time you want to move a bunch of colors in a row. Cycle stagger, so make things go back and forth between two values. So we're going to cover a bunch of those today. The first one we're going to go over is motion along a path, because it's one of my favorites. It's really hard to make realistic motion without motion along a path. I animated these fireflies and watched a lot of videos of fireflies. I think my roommates thought I was crazy. So fireflies do this weird thing where they kind of like turn on and off, and then they flicker, and then they go back into another place in time. And if you just do that with XY values, you're never going to get that motion correct, because it's actually like a not linear motion. They kind of move in a circle, and they move with the circle. So really, I just pass these arrays of values, and that GreenSock will interpret the kind of space in between those values for me. So if we have a Bezier tween with curvedness set to 0 and then curviness set to 2, it'll set them a little bit differently. So, okay, I want you to think about a bunch of different points, and then think about a rubber band going in between those points. And if it's super taut, it's going to just do nothing. It's just going to go like this. But if you let the rubber band go a little bit, it's going to get like a little bit less, like a little bit more like a circle. And then eventually, it's going to kind of like unravel on itself. So if I go to like 8, this is going for 0, and then it kind of unravels. So like the first time I saw that, I'm like, I don't understand, why is that happening? But if you understand the mechanics behind how that's working, it makes a lot more sense. Auto rotate true or false is really, really important for like making something look like it's real. Like if I do this, that guy doesn't look like he's real. I don't know what that is. I thought it was an owl, but my friend thinks it's a fish. I make these things late at night. I'm like not sure what it is. So relative color tweening is a really, really great one. So here's an example. I just wrote an article called A Nerd's Guide to Color on the Web, where I went into like a lot of technical detail about how color on the web works, because I'm a nerd. And hue, saturation, and brightness is like the most human readable use of those values. So if I like kind of change these, I understand that like all of the values, I don't have to go like green to like a lighter green for each one of these colors. I can, change them depending on where they already are. Eventually we're going to get to the top of hue and of brightness and saturation, but with hue it rotates in a 360 degrees, so I can just keep going, and I do like to keep going because I think he's cute and I like his little tail moving. Is it weird if you like your own creatures? I'm not sure. So what we do is I'm caching this as a value so that I can use it both on fill and body and change them at the same time. Fill is for SVG elements, and background color. Background color is for CSS elements, so I can make them move at the same time, and then I can make something like this, which is a city construction site, like a website. Get it? Terrible. So again, I can kind of play with this, but what's really cool is I can make the city a whole different color using those kind of variations and change them depending on where they're at. So I can even change them to another one based off of the first one and get strange combinations. And I can change the perspective just for fun. So draggable, I actually use draggable to do those timelines. I've just plotted a timeline across a 360 degrees and like made the timeline progress move. That's how I did that. So it's actually fairly simple. And so it's just like these minimum rotations and maximum rotations, and I plot the master progress along there. So that's how I'm doing those if you ever want to try it. Draggable is really fun, and like maybe we should do like a Mr. Potato. I'm gonna make me actually, so I don't, there's no weird, I used to have red hair and now it's this other color, so now I'm just gonna put a mixture of things on my head and some shoes, right, there we go. All right, cool, and it's really as simple as this. I'm using throw props plugins so that I can have a little bit of physics when I'm moving these things around. It's also really good for responsive and draggable, so it keeps it really consistent. This is an astronaut that's like constantly like surprised by this cow jumping over the moon, and it stays really consistent for mobile, which is really nice. And the draggable is touch device enabled for touch screens. So responsive, let's talk about that real quick. There was a really, really great article by Joe Harrison about this technique on Smashing Magazine on how you can change a sprite that's an SVG based on its background, just like a normal sprite. But like, let's do something even cooler with it, right? We can make an animation. So I designed all of these for like desktop, tablet, and mobile, and made it like less and, like less complexity for each one. And then I kind of dried it out when I was coding, so I took some stuff out and then I make it this big sprite. So that when I'm working with this pen, I can go back and forth and the animation changes as I'm working with it, which is really nice. But the nicest thing about all of this is that whole animation and SVG was 8 kilobytes gzipped. Now compare, in text and everything. So compare that to using text with photos to illustrate an article. This is a really, really engaging and informative way to work with things. And you can make really beautiful things without doing a ton of effort and actually save yourself a ton of resources. It's good for performance. So the other nice thing about it is that it's really scalable, right? That's in the name. So if I'm gonna let this animation play, what's happening is it's actually animating according to DOM elements, so I can keep resizing it, and it doesn't matter because it's moving things according to the SVG DOM, so I can keep like changing it up and it'll totally stay stable, which is really, really awesome, unlike CSS animation or elements. But we don't just do squishy things for responsive design, right? That's not the only thing we do, so let's implement some actual responsive design now. So if we can think about like designing and deving like Legos, so I've got this responsive huggy laser panda factory like you have in real life here, and we have these different sections, and I've kind of made the mobile and desktop versions of these, and I'm scoping my functions, those animation functions, with my design for those designs. So if I change the design, I know exactly where to go into the code, and I can just keep that really, really simple between the two. And then when I work with it, I can, hit all of these spots. So here he becomes lasered, and then here he becomes a panda, and there he becomes huggy, like, normal, responsive, huggy laser pandas. And then it, changes shape for mobile and is totally stable for mobile. So that's pretty fun. So it's really quite simple. We're just pausing the timeline initially so that we can call it again on click. I just used jQuery here to show how simple this can be. And here's the function. I'm not showing you all the code there that we're calling, and we can just call it again and again. So I'm probably running out of time here. We're going to go quickly through the rest of it. If we're going to emulate things in real life, I know people think of SVGs as only being straight and strict and vector and flat, but there's a lot of other things you can do with it. So if we're trying to make atmosphere, and like sometimes the atmosphere is the character here, We can think about elemental motion, like things that are further away is in less contrast and blurrier. To ask yourself if the air or environment affects the movement. And reducing precision allows you to understand how to work with these things. So if I'm going to try to make this smoke happen, that's really hard, right? Like, how am I going to make smoke happen? But if I start reducing the precision here, then I can see that it's really made up of a bunch of little balls and things like that. And that is actually something that I can animate, because I can start thinking about how those balls are moving in on themselves and being affected by the air and the movement. So I can put a bunch of techniques together, like that morph SVG that we saw earlier, and point from one to the other. This GSAP plugin, morph SVG, allows you to point from one ID to the other, and they don't have to be the same path points, and they can just change shape. That's really great. So if we're using, and we can also use a plugin called Find Shape Index, which allows us to have finite control of how that animation morphs, how it all changes, because you can see how differently that behaves when it's different values. So we can make something like fire with something that's supposed to be vector, something that's supposed to be math, and something that's supposed to be rigid. So how do we do this? We have a candle and we have a bunch of paths, right? And I'm just making them blue so that you can see the difference between all of these paths. I made just a bunch of paths. In Illustrator, I just drew a few simple gradients for the bottom of the candle here. So those are like 4 paths with just a few different gradients on them. And then that gradient in the back, I'm going to make bigger and smaller as the flame kind of moves. And then this was kind of taken off of the idea of this GUI menu by Lucas Beber. I think his thing is kind of not working right now, but basically when you have a filter effect that's a contrast and blur together, they make this goo effect, which is really, really cool. So you can't animate standard deviations in CSS. That's not an animatable property, but in JavaScript you can do it. So GreenSock allows you to animate things that are unanimatable, which is really nice. So I'm animating that filter. That's really cool. And then I'm just looping through, I named all of the flames F1, F2, F3. I'm looping through all of them and using that morph. So there's another way of doing this. I could have used this thing called a Catmull-Rom spleen. This is a pen by Blake Bowen, kind of showing how that works. He didn't invent that. That's actually like, there's an article about its history in computer science. It's very close to what we used. I think it's actually what we used for that Bezier motion path. It just softens something. So if I'm going to pass in a bunch of path points, I could have also just passed in a bunch of path points and morphed those and changed those and altered those. So I didn't just have to build everything in Illustrator. If I wasn't a designer, I could have made this as just a dev. So I can also make things like smoke. So things like that are really cool and nice, like things that you don't expect Vector to be able to do, you actually can. So the last thing we're going to talk about here that I really like is viewbox as a camera. So we can actually update values of the viewbox and make it like flowcharts and data visualizations really, really awesome. So if I'm looking at the viewbox, like viewbox is a property that people get really scared by. It looks a little bit scary, but really it's just a coordinate. If you've ever played Battleship or something like that, it's like 0 and 0, and then the width, 384.5. And the height, 250. So if I'm trying to get different coordinates, I would just go 160, 160, and then the width is 42, and the height is 20. So there's this native thing in our browsers called getBbox that will return an object called SVG-rect that gives us X, Y, width, and height. Pretty cool, right? Because that's exactly what we need in order to update those values. So we can actually create something that's a little bit dynamic. Here we're just zooming into just those houses. And then we can make something like this that's really, really very simple. And I'm just zooming, it's all just the same map. I'm just zooming into a part of it. And again, because we're dealing with SVG, it's really scalable for responsive. So we can also make things like this flowchart. Like if you're looking for the graphic image, like a graphic format to use, are you interested in responsive? Is it an image with tonal variation? No. Is it super complex? Not really. SVG. So I can, you can keep going through all of the like permutations of that flow chart, but people can use it really quickly and easily, and that's really super awesome. And the code for that is so simple. I have this one function, I'm just updating that string and animating it, and I just pass in the values for what I want when they click it and where they're going, and where they click it and where they're going, and that's it. And so the last thing we're going to do is just play with all of these things at once. So web animation or web audio API allows you to plug into sounds and things like that, and we can update SVGs. So each one of these triggers a different SVG animation. So we have these, like, you can see that I can change the like HSLA every time on that one. There's lightning. So that, you can make any manner of cool things with that. And all we're doing here is saying, like, we used like a radius and a CY and CX points, and we're updating those and we're checking those. And then we're like scaling it, and then when it actually pops, we're setting it back. And all we have to do is when it hits that, we're playing the sound as well. And because we're using SVG and keyboards are not that easy on mobile sometimes, we can also expose a different SVG for the keyboard. So all of those become the keyboard that you can play with because we don't have the ASDF on desktop. So you can make your own kind of fake keyboard while you're working on that too. I'm not the only one who works with these kind of technologies. There's tons of other really super smart people that you should go follow. They're all really awesome. There's also podcasts and newsletters. Val Head and I are making this thing called web animation workshops. We're going around the country in the United States and then into Europe next year. So if you want to come to one of our workshops, it's going to be like a long version of this where you start off maybe not knowing that much about animation at all, and we'll take you through not just SVG animation, but all of web animation. I'm also writing an O'Reilly book called SVG Animation. This is not the cover for this book. This is my friend trolling me. I don't have the man blobfish. That's not even how you spell my last name. This is the cover of my book. I think I have a fancy chicken. And thank you.